So displacing our presenter. Okay, so I am delighted to present our last moderator of the day, Professor Sonia Katyal. Professor Katyal is a Chancellor's Professor of Law and co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology here at UC Berkeley's Bolt Law School. Her scholarly work focuses on the intersection of technology, intellectual property, and civil rights. Her past projects have studied the relationship between copyright enforcement and informational privacy, the impact of branding and trademark law on freedom of expression, and the intersection between copyright law and gender with respect to cultural works. That one's for my undergraduate that needed the gender mention. Katyal also works on issues relating to cultural property and art with a special focus on new media and the role of museums in the United States and abroad. So she will present first and then bring up her other panelists, and they'll engage in our final discussion of the day. Join me in welcoming Professor Katyal.
Thanks. It's really great to be here. This is the last panel of the day. I told the other speakers that I expected fireworks, so hopefully they'll deliver. So I wanted to actually start off. So as Rebecca mentioned, my name is Sonia Katyal, and I teach law here at Berkeley, and I focus mostly on the intersection of intellectual property with new media issues. And so to kind of set the stage for this panel, I thought it might be useful to start with a story. So a couple of years ago, two artists, one armed with a surreptitiously hidden 3D scanner under a blue cashmere scarf, walked into the Neue Museum in Berlin and, in clear defiance of the strict no photography rule, allegedly walked out after garnering a 3D scan of the famous bust of Nefertiti. And the artist then titled the resulting product The Other Nefertiti, and they claimed that it was a perfect replica of the original. And then they released the scan online with a Creative Commons license so that anyone could download and replicate the bust for their own purposes. The project had two motivations. The first was to display their own 3D printed version in Egypt as a statement against the theft of cultural properties by Western nations. But the second motivation was also to protest the strict limitations that museums often place on sharing their informational data regarding their works with the public. Now, ironically, as some of you probably know, a few weeks later, the whole story was revealed to be false. It turned out that the scan that the artist used, it seemed, was actually most likely a scan that came directly from the museum archives itself. But the purported falsity of the story, it seems, at least to me, only further underscores the value of what the artists were trying to say about the relationship between technology, cultural artifacts, and the notion of private property. While precise digital imaging of such politically and emotionally fraught cultural properties, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Elgin marbles, have not stilled the protests about the legalities of their current physical possession, noted one expert, they have nonetheless created a new kind of cultural property, a kind of meta-cultural property that represents a shared global culture that we are creating today. And today's museum essentially has been made possible by an explosion of digitization technologies that can precisely replicate works of art and make them available to a wider audience. And these technologies, of course, have never been more striking, particularly in an era where news reports continually discuss footage of the destruction of cultural properties by terrorism, war, climate change, and other challenges. But today's era, I think, can be sort of characterized by two sort of overlapping and yet kind of conflicting themes. And the first of these involves the consistent eruption of outright destruction, right, of cultural properties, which obviously reduces the pool of available antiquities for public viewing and appreciation. But the second theme is almost conflicting, and that is one of marked mass redistribution. At the same moment that we now see a seemingly endless array of attacks on cultural property and antiquities, we also see a tremendous explosion of the availability of their replication. So one theme contracts the pool of cultural resources, and the other expands it. So with the advent of 3D printing, mapping technologies, other sophisticated forms of information technology, the preservation and the replication of antiquities has never been easier. But at the same time, the more these cultural properties become digitized, the more likely it is that copyright law, with all of its restrictions and limitations, will rear its head. And that is why the Nefertiti episode is so revealing. It demonstrates, almost to an unbelievable degree, both the limitations as well as the possibilities behind the marriage of technology and cultural heritage, a phenomenon that I've called techno-heritage. So just as technology has the power to preserve and protect ancient artifacts, it also invites a dizzying array of legal conflicts over their digitization, particularly regarding the intersection of property principles, copyright law, and cultural identity. Now, clearly the replication of these items of cultural heritage, when coupled with the role of technology, is sort of priceless in its possibilities. But at the same time, as soon as information technology enters the picture, so does the legal ability to control through principles of property law, which is sort of like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So every time someone makes a copy of something, whether through a photograph or 3D printer, they often unwittingly bring copyright law to regulate their creations. And while we normally think of copyright law as a good thing for artists, because it helps them profit from and recoup the cost of their creations, it can also be a bad thing for the public who might want access to their goods. So the more interesting question is whether these potential disputes are reruns of the same intellectual property issues that we've seen in the past, or whether there's something new here that we haven't yet anticipated. So in other words, the sophistication of virtual and augmented reality and 3D printing might actually be its greatest challenge. And it signifies what I think is a really interesting conversion of cultural property into intellectual property. And the difference between the two regimes underscores how we think about property, identity, and ownership. So consider that cultural property laws are intrinsically motivated by a desire to retain, repatriate, preserve, protect, authenticate tangible artifacts of cultural heritage. But intellectual property law is actually motivated, in fact, towards the opposite. The guiding focus of intellectual property involves an almost singular focus on profit from replication, involving the control of commercial exploitation, reproduction, and distribution. And intellectual property laws are also motivated in part by recognition of the need to preserve sort of building blocks of raw materials for future creators. And so that's why we have protections like fair use allowances for the purposes of remix and appropriation. By digitizing and replicating cultural properties, however, the conversion of these items into items of intellectual property often means that their owners fail to recognize the limitations that surround copyright law in general. So museums use contractual provisions to limit access to visitors unless they promise not to scan, photograph, or replicate the materials, even when those materials are in the public domain and might be subject to fair use protections. There's the phenomenon of copyfraud, which happens when an owner asserts copyright protection in elements or creations that are actually not copyrightable as a way to control access to an object. Consider a couple of examples of this. In the late 1980s, researchers discovered a series of human brain fragments in Morocco, and they used laser scanning, magnetic resource imaging, and CT scans to develop a data set of the composite skull image at a museum in France that was storing the fragments. Both the museum and the Moroccan government claimed a copyright interest in the data sets, the laser scans, the magnetic resonance images, and the CT scans. So although they allowed researchers to use the data sets to create a composite image of the skull, they required that the data sets were never to be made public as a precondition for access. In another example, a group of archaeologists working with a grant from the European community attempted to digitize government photos and imaging data from a Greek site for the purposes of producing a sort of interactive compact disc about the site. But the Greek Ministry of Culture refused to allow them to digitize the photos, and they claimed a copyright interest in the material. But even when the researchers attempted to gather their own images and data without relying on the government's material, the archaeologists were actually banned from the site. So governments can use the threat of copyright infringement to restrict access to cultural materials, or they can put restrictions on non-publication, making non-publication a condition of access. or they can just declare that they own all of the data and the images outright. And even more striking is the fact that, the allegedly protected material might not be copyrightable at all. So in one case, Augustana College asked an artist to remove computer-aided design files of an exact replica of the Michelangelo sculpture of Moses that was installed on its campus, even though the sculpture was firmly in the public domain. In another, more ironic case, a designer named Ulrich Swanish created a 3D file for the famed Penrose or Impossible Triangle, and then he challenged others to do the same thing. But when another person actually figured out how to replicate Schwanitz's 3D design and posted it on the internet, Schwanitz sent him a cease and desist letter, even though he didn't even own a copyright in the original triangular design. And here's another example. Around 16 years ago at the University of Washington and Stanford, a group of students and faculty created a 3D scan of Michelangelo's David. Now, even though the scan was the product of a group of students and faculty, a single professor, a retired member of Stanford's computer science department, gets to decide who gets these scans, and only gives the scans to, quote, established and published scholars, and requires them never to circulate the scans to students or even post on the internet. And even more troubling, in order to receive access to the model, one has to, quote, keep renderings and use of the data in good taste, because the artifacts in question are, quote, the proud artistic patrimony of Italy. Now, at the same, and this is David, Michelangelo, right? At the same time that we might be concerned about taste-related limitations on remix and reuse of cultural properties, we also have to be really mindful of the way in which technology historically has also tended to obscure the concerns of indigenous peoples who have been used both as objects of study and their sacred artifacts misused. So while the community of open access advocates have often, and rightly so, chided museums for their restricted policies, many members of the copyleft community have often tended to overlook the very significant concerns that are raised by indigenous communities with respect to the digital dissemination of traditional knowledge. So while it might be arguably true that, quote, information wants to be free, which is what the copyleft community often says, there are also cultures that believe that restrictions on that material is actually an essential part of cultural survival. So a central area of conflict stems from the digitization which can occur before an indigenous community has actually had the ability to survey the information and other concerns about cultural privacy. So the question that we're left with is whether there's a way to protect the valid rights and concerns that museums may have over controlling access to their collection, with the inevitable pull of the trend towards greater digitization. And digitization has the power, as some might say, to democratize the museum, making artifacts and collections more widely available and free for remix and reuse. So this panel today is really about the limitations and the possibilities that this kind of techno-heritage represents, but it focuses on the very real issues of publication and digitization today. So some of the issues that we're going to talk about in this panel involve the following. What are the challenges of integrating new technologies with academic publishing? How does a virtual publication flag interpretation integrate itself with the circulation of factual information? How can the work of the archaeologist, the coder, the designer be properly acknowledged in this context? And what are the ethical concerns that are associated with digital reconstructions and virtual reality and augmented reality? Should access always be, quote, freely downloadable, or should it have a limited print run? How might companies and academics develop best practices that will seek to balance these competing concerns? So to help us sort out these questions, we have an amazing panel of commentators. We'll start off with Rachel Opitz, who joins us from the University of Glasgow, Stuart Eve, who joins us from the University of College London, and Maurizio Forte, Forte, from Duke University. So we'll start with Rachel Opitz. And she comes to us from the University of Glasgow. She has an active research program that is focused on rural Western Mediterranean societies and landscapes in the first millennium BCE. Her research investigates how different rural communities are operating within these increasingly interconnected Mediterranean world. And the foundations of this work lie in remote sensing and survey methods. Human perception of the built and natural environment is studied through formal exercises and 3D modeling, and analysis of the visual attention of users of the models and the material culture of rural communities and the towns emerging within them. And her recognized methodological expertise includes photogrammetric modeling in the context of excavations, work that is primarily carried out at the Gabii project, a major research excavation in central Italy. It's also performed in LiDAR analysis of sites and landscapes, works primarily carried out through method surveys in the French Comté, and in developing information metrics to ask new archaeological questions using 3D data. She's currently pursuing the application of perceptual saliency metrics to investigate the way humans visually perceive the basic elements of their surroundings, which has important implications for the organization of space in built environments and the placement of structures and markers in landscapes. So she also serves as the chair of the Aerial Archaeology Research Group and also is a member of the Archeo Landscapes International Project General Management Board, and she also directs Spark. So welcome, Rachel. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, I'm going to try to live up to that very extensive and generous introduction to various bits of my work, but what I'm actually here to talk about today is specifically my work at the Gabii project, which is a large excavation in central Italy. It is a project that has been really pushing to integrate digital technologies both into how we record data in our excavations, and importantly into how we then interpret data and how we publish, how we communicate our archaeological interpretations and findings with various audiences. And this project is led by Nicola Terranato from the University of Michigan, Laura Banducci from Carleton University, Andrew Johnston from Yale University, myself, Anna Gallone, who is associated with Cavo Scara in Venice. So we're really a kind of big, slightly chaotic crew. And one of the interesting things that has come out of the process of bringing the Gabii project's materials to publication is how we are changing our way of doing archaeology, because as a collective with varying levels of technical expertise, varying stories that we want to tell, we each have our own kind of disciplinary perspective, even within the team, how we can communicate with other people what it is we're finding on the site. So today I'm going to be presenting to you kind of our story, our path to our current and future digital publications of our archaeological excavation. So as some of you may know, in 2017, we had the first of a frighteningly large number of digital volumes planned for the Gabii excavation come out with the University of Michigan Press. This is a digital-only publication. It is intended primarily for an academic audience, although we are also, and I'll be discussing this, trying to think about how we talk to other audiences. It is currently, and for the next 3 months, open access available on the web, so I encourage you all to go and read it and tell us what we've done wrong, which seems to be what people do when they read it. And as you can see up here, trying to address some of the issues that Sonia set us up with, there are an enormous number of authors whose work goes into this. And when you'll notice we've said written and crafted by. So I want to highlight that. One of the questions that was raised to us here, one of the things that changes when we're publishing and communicating through digital media and and really taking the digital content seriously, not just as an appendix, but as something that's central to what we're doing. The people who do the digital handiwork, who design your interface, who manage the 3D models, who spend time trimming the 3D models to match the limits of your excavation unit, which you care about if you're an archaeologist, all of that work is integral to your publication. So whether or not you have written words, you are creating the visual media that is part of the communication. So you get credit, right? That's part of the work. Digital publication has forced us to rethink a lot of what we're doing. So what I'm presenting to you here today is really our first experimental foray into new ways in which we might be publishing. And luckily, we are not the only ones on this journey of experimenting with new ways that we can publish archaeological information through digital media. So, and I want to highlight, Elaine spoke earlier today, Digital Karnak are experimenting with how we can publish digital media. They're doing very different things than what we're doing, which is great. The Aplantis project, John Clark, also experimenting with how we can publish using digital media. There's a really interesting publication of the House of Diana at Pompeii by a Spanish group. They put out kind of a multimedia interactive group. So there are all of these experiments going on right now from different backgrounds involving different teams that are looking at how we can take the fact that we can now do digital publication and how this can really affect the style of our publication, the substance of our publication, and what we're doing. And it's forced us within our project, and I think other people who are trying to do the same thing, to really ask some tough questions. Who are our audiences? Are we really only writing for an academic audience if we publish on the web? Or do we hope or assume that there's going to be a broader public readership? I, for one, hope that we have a broader public readership, but then maybe we have to change a bit how we're publishing, what it is we're doing. What are the differences then between how we write and present information and narratives for a scholarly audience, the web public, as I'm kind of referring to, the big public of people who read things on the internet, and museum visitors? These are really different styles of communication. The way you write an information card or kind of a plaque of information for a museum is very different than the way you write in an academic article. So how can we maybe connect these things within a digital publication? And I really want to emphasize that I think there's a lot of value in more closely connecting these platforms and venues, and I think this is something that the digital world is really enabling us to do, to think about the links between how we communicate to a general public, a public who are maybe museum goers, and a then kind of more scholarly academic public. And there's a lot of interest surrounding these topics. And in doing my research for this paper, I discovered that there was a meeting by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists in Historic England just in December 2017, Challenges for Archaeological Publication in a Digital Age. Who are we writing this stuff for anyway, in traditional British style of being slightly informal? And I think they're asking many of the questions that I'd like us to be asking here today. How can we secure and enhance the public and academic benefits of archaeological publication at a time when most fieldwork is carried out by the commercial sector and digital technologies are challenging traditional modes of dissemination? There's a whole conversation around this. And they specifically ask things like, are we clear on the boundary between publication and archive, and does this need to change? And I think this has been coming up in various ways today. When are we archiving? When are we publishing? And does the gap between these things matter? If we can access most information online, what should the main report comprise? Is it evidence? Is it synthesis? Is it a popular account? Can we say, okay, we've published our data and we're now focusing on the storytelling? Can we improve public engagement without neglecting our professional and academic responsibilities to publish? Do we really have to publish these honestly terribly boring excavation reports that nobody wants to read and engage with just to fulfill some mental, professional expectation? Or can we write more exciting, engaging things? And maybe get ourselves out of that box, which leads us to, if we were to start again, what would our ideal forms of archaeological publication be? And so I think we're in a really exciting moment to kind of reimagine what it is an archaeological publication is going to look like. And the group that met in the UK was looking back at, in fact, a 2003 set of recommendations and arguing for more synthesis, greater integration, and greater attention to narrative style, my emphasis. And kind of saying that this is going to be controversial and that it requires a departure from the orthodox model. And I think that we really do need to depart from the orthodox model of archaeological excavation publication and totally rethink it and kind of imagine audiences of the future and say, okay, what do we want our publications to look like when people are reading our excavation reports in a VR environment? How do we read in virtual reality? How do we get information about people's interpretations of an archaeological excavation if we're engaging with that content in VR or with interactive 3D content online? This is where we need to be thinking. And so the Gabii project has taken a few kind of tentative steps into this direction. So what really happened was back in 2009, when we started excavating at Gabii, we started doing a lot of this 3D structure for motion work, and we made it a kind of normal part of our recording process. We were doing your typical total station survey. We were taking lots of photos. We had hand-drawn sketches. We had a big digital database. We had a GIS. And we were collecting all of this really rich information. We could tell it was impacting how we were interpreting the site because we all used the digital data and 3D models when we were making our interpretations. And so we kind of said, okay, so this has to be part of our publications because it doesn't make any sense for us to only give our kind of reading public a very small part of the data set that we're working with. And so from 2011 to 2013, we ran a project which many people in this room contributed to in providing feedback, 21st century data, 21st century publications, 3D models, and building the peer reviewer community, a terribly long title. We refer to it as Gabii Goes Digital, which was really about how we could start thinking about publishing 3D models as scholarly objects. So not just as something for fun, not just as something that would sit in an appendix, but as something that would sit at the heart of our excavation publications, because we believed it was a way to really show what we were seeing, the data that we were looking at, to everyone else. And so through the work of this project, we really started to break apart what our publication was going to look like, because we said, okay, so the text is going to be on the side, and we're going to put this interactive 3D model in the middle. So that kind of turns things upside down. And we were doing this in collaboration with the very patient and tolerant people at the University of Michigan Press who agreed to come on this small adventure with us. And so the Gabii publications are, in the end, trying to do things with the format of the excavation report and excavation publication that are, I think, a little bit different. So I'm just going to take you briefly through some of the things that we've decided to do. We've got our kind of 3D interactive model, which is built in Unity and integrates all our photogrammetric models, which you see there on the right from your point of view. And you can have kind of an aerial view, and you can walk around it, and if you click on the little trowel icons, you get pop-up information. It links you out to our project's database. And we've written the text in 3 layers, which we refer to as story, more, and details. The story level is intended for a general audience. The more level is kind of at the level of a synthetic article, and the details level is really kind of the nitty-gritty details. And so what we feel we've done is we've created this situation where we can give you a kind of constructed narrative, a creative story. So, you know, this is our cake that is baked by an expert that is sitting on top of the data that we've published. And the text, which I will not read out, really is written in a very once upon a time style. And somehow an academic press has allowed us to do this, which is pretty great. And so this sits on top of the more level, which is, as I said, kind of written like an article style, which then sits on top of the details, which then give you kind of access to the database. The data is then published as open data. So the database is in fact in 2 locations. It's on the University of Michigan Press servers, and we've also given a copy to the nice people at Open Context. So, you know, and the publication itself is, there's a price, and we are in constant negotiation with the press about what that price number should be, but the data is being published in an open way. And I think this is another interesting challenge with digital publication. So we've got this obligation to make the primary archive available, as noted by the CHIFA Historic England workshop, you know, that we really do feel this obligation to make the data available. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to open publish the stories on top of it. And so I think there's an interesting tension, and Sonia, your remarks on copyright, I think, speak to this in terms of data and things that are in public domain, and then maybe interpretations of them and how we value those interpretations. So there are interesting conversations happening around this. And Next slide, maybe. There we go. And as we're doing all of this work, we're really designing our publications then as these kind of multi-part, multifaceted, interactive digital products. So we have our data, and we're linking between our text and our data. The data is open. The text, some of it is open. It's currently all open, but most of the time you have to kind of pay to get our interpretation. We're linking across these layers of text for different audiences. So you can click on hyperlinks in the story level, and it takes you to the more level. You can click on things in the more level, it takes you to the details level, or it takes you out to the interactive 3D model. We have spent a lot of time developing vocabularies of symbols and styles to help you kind of interpret what's going on with our data. And again, I encourage you to go and play around with the publication and see how well our symbol sets work for you. Hopefully everyone can tell that the chicken is faunal remains, and the coins are coin remains, and the little pots are ceramics. So really starting to think about how we can design our publications to speak to maybe a wider variety of audiences, and how we can kind of synthesize. And so this is really an ongoing process for us. And we've been doing this with the University of Michigan Press, and we've had generous support both from the Mellon Foundation and the University of Michigan through their collaboratory program. And this is really where we are right now, really thinking about what a publication platform is that can try and support these really kind of non-traditional digital publications, and we're currently using kind of a platform, Hydro, Fedora, and Fulcrum, that is supporting both our interactive 3D Unity content and our text content, kind of all of our linked text. But how do we design content for this? How do we migrate it into the future every 3 to 5 years as the technology changes? So therefore, what does the production process look like? And how do we kind of write for this variety of audiences? And so just to wrap up, this is really making us rethink kind of the roles within the digital publication ecosystem. Our relationship with the press is really different than I think a traditional author-publisher relationship. And it's really making us think about what makes data valuable, maybe embedding it in stories, maybe getting it to be reusable, getting it to be out there and persistent, letting other people take our data and contradict what we've said and come up with new ideas, which I certainly hope will happen. And also what makes interface valuable, because we've really invested a lot in our interface. So thinking about how interface can encourage flexibility and connectivity and getting people to engage both with our data and our interpretive process. And finally, kind of connecting between these different layers of text that are written for different audiences, our data, our research process, and really thinking about what our priorities are for publication. When we talk to one another as scholars, we care a lot about rigor and clarity. When we talk to a public, we care a lot about maybe innovation and being relevant. We really want to be relevant, or kind of context and application, which we prioritize maybe with students. So hopefully that's giving us all some food for thought as we head into the rest of this panel. Thank you very much.
Stuart is currently a research associate at the University of Leicester, looking at the use of mixed reality for visualizing and exploring the archaeological landscape of Avebury in Wiltshire in the UK. He specializes in combining GIS and spatial analysis techniques with a body-centered phenomenological view of the landscape. And as a founding partner of the commercial archaeology firm, LP, Stuart is also interested in bridging the academic and the commercial gap, taking inspiration and method from both sides to further current archaeological practice. Stuart is also an architect of the Archaeological Recording Kit, which is an open source online GIS database system for storing and querying archaeological data. So, Stuart, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, I've just realized that I'm demonstrating the British informality that Rachel said, and I'm actually only wearing a t-shirt, so I apologize for that. It's California, that's fine. That's great. So I've been working with augmented reality and archaeology for, I guess, 10 years or so now, and I've augmented all sorts of things into the real world. I'm mostly interested in landscapes, so I've augmented roundhouses into the Bronze Age moors of Cornwall, smell of farm animals into a physical reconstruction of a farm in Denmark. And I've also even augmented the voices of the dead into a cemetery in York in the UK. So as you can tell, I'm kind of into this multi-sensory aspect of augmented reality rather than just the visual. Because what I've really found during doing these different studies and everything is that actually AR is really, really good at demonstrating and including these multi-sensory aspects. But currently, as you can see, AR and also virtual reality are mainly dominated by the visual inputs. We put on these headsets and we see, and then obviously we sometimes hear the experience that's kind of been curated for us. And it's very, very rare for us to actively engage any of our other senses during these experiences. And I think that this lack of multisensory aspects very much affects the way that we learn about, the way that we investigate, and also the way that we publish about the past as well. So for instance, as archaeologists, we would look at the remains of, say, this temple. And the first thing that probably comes to mind when we look at the scattered masonry and everything is, what did this temple look like? What was the edifice like? Where was the altar? We might do a 3D point cloud of it, a non-subjective 3D point cloud of it. And then we could find out where that altar was. You know, we could start playing with the floor plans. We could start putting it back together. We could go to the library. We could look for some epigraphy, and we could kind of read about maybe who that temple was dedicated to. But of course, these temples were places that were used, and often they were used for things like animal sacrifice, for instance. So how often as archaeologists do we actually think about the smell of the animals that were brought to be sacrificed, or the sound of the gush of blood that comes out of their neck when it hits the ground, or the smell of that blood, or the heat of that blood, or the way the temperature change affects us bodily as we move closer and further away from the sacrificial fires? What if there is dancing or chanting or things like that? How does that ritual affect us as human beings? So much more than the visual, basically. So these very, very visceral things, the kind of the stench, the sounds, the tastes, I think would have been way more effective and emotionally powerful for the humans in the past than the particular shade of stone in the column or the exact geometry of the way the shadows went across the courtyard or whatever. But we obsess about these things when we make 3D models, right? So we obsess about this kind of visual fidelity. We've got to get it right. But we completely ignore these other senses, always, with possibly the exception of sound, but that's a different talk. So what can we do about that? As we, I don't know why that slide is, but anyway. As we all know from teaching, for instance, this hands-on experience, this kind of embodied experience, is actually vastly superior, I think, at least, from someone standing up and giving a very boring lecture or reading from a book. I mean, I remember my practical classes and my field trips way more than I do the lectures about ancient coinage or what have you. Probably why I'm an archaeologist, not a historian, but let's not get into that. But I think it's this kind of hands-on multi-sensory aspects that AR is so well suited for and so good at. So as a quick illustration, I want to use a example app that I built during something called the Heritage Jam, which is a 2-day hackathon run out of the University of York. Now I was a bit wary of this because obviously we've had some pretty fancy projects shown so far today, and this is literally built on my kitchen table. In fact, you will see my kitchen table in the next slide, so please bear that in mind. It was a hackathon and it was developed very, very quickly. But what I wanted to do was create a way for zoo archaeologists, so animal bone specialists, to take a bone, compare it to a reference collection, and then identify what that bone was, basically. Now, in normal practice, if a zooarchaeologist wants to identify a bone, they'll either know it off the top of their head, or they will look up the shape and dimensions in the books or online resource, or they will go to a museum or a university and open up some drawers and pull out physical reference collections to compare that bone to until they kind of match it up. So what I wanted to do was create an app which would allow the zooarchaeologist or the student or whoever to be able to hold the bone that they're trying to identify in real reality and then compare it to any other number of exemplar bones from 3D scanned reference collections. Again, this is all about open data and how we reuse other people's assets. Sorry, Adam, for using the word asset, but there's a whole load of 3D scanning going on all over the world, as we've already seen. It all gets uploaded to places like Sketchfab or what have you. There's all sorts of things up there, and I really wanted to find a way to repurpose that and actually use these 3D scans to find out new things, basically. But I also wanted to make sure that the zooarchaeologist or the student or whoever's using the app, I wanted to make sure that they understood this kind of entire multi-sensory aspect of the animal that they're looking at. So I used Unity and the reasonably recent advent of the AR kit, which is Apple's augmented reality library, and I built the Artifact kit. So bear in mind, it was built in a day. It's filmed off my phone. So apologies for the interface as well. It's extremely clunky. Right. So at this point, this is looking through my phone. You can probably tell which bits are real and which bits aren't. That's a real bone in the middle, obviously. And I'm about to pick up that bone and compare it to a virtual reference collection. The first thing I do here is look at the bone and say, I think it's probably not a bird bone, for instance, that one. I think it's probably a deer bone. So then I can take that deer bone and then start comparing it to these 3D scanned bones, which I've downloaded freely off the internet. They're on my kitchen table, and then I can use the real bone and compare it whilst looking through my phone to the virtual bones. And you can get quite close in. You can start looking at the ends and at the ends and everything like that, until you can identify which species and, of course, which type of bone it is. And this kind of pulls into this haptic controller thing that you were talking about earlier, where at the moment I'm holding the phone in my hand, but obviously you could put it in a Google Cardboard or something and have completely hands-free, so actually your interface is the real bone, which is kind of interesting rather than mouse clicking or what have you. And you rotate the bones by just looking at the word rotate, which is also augmented on my messy kitchen table. So here's my kitchen. So once you've identified the species, what I really wanted to do was give an idea of what this actual animal is, right? Because it's very easy when you deal with skeletal remains to forget that these bones actually come from real living animals that breathe, that have fur, that have a size. So these animals here are the real size red deer standing in my kitchen. Kind of weird. But I think it really gives you a really nice, different way of looking at the way these animals are and their relative sizes and everything like that. So this next slide, I've also augmented a virtual map, 3D map with bar charts which display the particular species that you're looking at. In this case, red deer. So the geographic distribution of red deer and their relative amounts. This data is taken directly from Open Context, which Rachel's already mentioned. So that's kind of pulling it in live. When you choose the species, it pulls it in. And again, this is repurposing online data, and that's really what I wanted to do, to try and use all of the stuff that's out there and just pull it into this kind of framework here. You'll also notice this thing here, which I'm just about to talk about. That is a virtual smell machine. So basically, it's connected in that white box there is an Arduino microcontroller, which connects to these 4 boxes, each of which has a computer fan in it and a particular smell. So I chose red deer. So in this case, the app knows what I've chosen. It connects via Bluetooth to the Arduino controller in that white box, sends a message to whichever one of these fans in those little boxes has the red deer smell, spins the fan up, and then I've got a wonderful waft of red deer musk in my nose. Who doesn't want that in their kitchen? Sorry. And then finally, I also, let me turn this down a little bit. Oh, I can't turn it down. Actually, you can listen. I don't know how to turn the sound off, I'm sorry. So he can go rutting in the background. So we have the sounds of this stag and everything kind of in your room, essentially. So I don't know if you saw the first part of that video, but that's a kind of portal which I augmented into my kitchen. So at any point, if you wanted to know what the habitat was like of this particular animal, or how it interacted with other animals, then you could sort of stick your head into the crazy 360-degree world and get an idea of that. So of course this project was built in just a couple of days, but I think it kind of shows how far you can already go with augmented reality as a kind of usable tool to reuse data that's out there, have a bit of fun with, you know, and really try and incorporate these other senses into the way that we think about archaeological remains. And I think it does help us to remember that the bones that we find in archaeological sites come from animals that were real animals. They had relationships with other animals. They smell really bad. And they're not just kind of abstract numbers on a spreadsheet, basically. Now, obviously, well, including the other senses in an experience of the past doesn't have to be a perfect reconstruction. I think it can just be used as a kind of nudge to make you think about things and sites, landscapes, or artifacts in a different way. So even if the kind of smell or sound or taste or feel is wrong, I'm pretty sure I don't have the kind of platonic smell of red deer musk in my smell machine. It does kind of force you to think about those other senses, basically. And if it feels wrong, it forces you to think about why it feels wrong. What's wrong about this experience? Why do I think it's wrong? What would it have been like? So I'm already thinking in kind of different ways by using these different senses. And of course, different senses use different parts of our brain as well. So we're firing off synapses all over the place that we wouldn't necessarily be doing just by looking at a visual 3D reconstruction. However, I think as we've already seen kind of during this whole day, really, it's hard enough for us to kind of agree on how to supply, archive, publish, preserve the 3D model point clouds. And now I've just added in at least 4 other senses, so I've probably made it 4 times harder for us to do that. So sorry, but basically, hopefully that'll give us some food for thought, and maybe we can talk about it in a bit. Thank you.
Great. Our next speaker and the final member of our panel is Maurizio Forte from Duke University. He is William and Sue Gross Professor of Classical Studies, Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University. He's the founder of Dig at Lab for Digital Knowledge of the Past at Duke. His main research topics are digital archaeology, Etruscan and pre-Roman archaeology, classical archaeology, neuroarchaeology. His primary area of archaeological research concerns questions involving the development, transformation, and decline of ancient cities. He's editor and author of several books, including, quote, Virtual Archaeology, Virtual Reality in Archaeology, From Space to Place, La Via di Libia, Un percorso di ricerca di archeologia, virtual, sorry, I'm sure there's a better way to say that. But he's also written more than 200 scientific papers. Very busy man, and we're very grateful that he could be here. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure for me to be back to Berkeley. So my presentation is mostly focused on my view on our view on digital knowledge and some critical point of view. First of all, it's something that I recall myself. We created 2.5 quintillion bytes of data digitally spread out in different devices and with different data capturing system. This is an estimate you can find in many places if you Google, but it's impressive to see a world with over 5 billion of smartphones in 2019, for example. And this is related, a lot related with a new impact in heritage, and mostly digital heritage. So we call this usually mediated reality. So, and selfie mania is one of the many ways we see actually this kind of hybrid reality active. So the first question to me is what is digital knowledge, and what is the relationship between this knowledge and what we call publishing? So first of all, there are a lot of new feedback, new input coming from different categories of users. So we can talk about co-creation, IP reality, new social media, augmented virtual reality, as the last speaker very well presented, and so on. And of course, because we are archaeologists, so questions are related on what happens in archaeology. I introduced a few years ago a book on cyber archaeology, actually trying to understand what the impact of this simulated past. I agree that we cannot have one single past. That's why the simulation process to me is the core of the work. And my first life in California, we try with one of the first immersive system in archaeology. It's a collaborative system at the time between UC Berkeley, UC Merced, and we have multiple users actually co-creating digital model. Unfortunately, it was just an experimental platform, but it's a way to think about the interpretation process as ongoing collaborative work. And later on, in Çatalhöyük in Turkey, I start a new experiment called 3D digging project, aimed at the reconstruction of the archaeological excavation by 3D digital modeling and virtual reality. This is the Duke immersive virtual reality environment where we have, in this case, a graduate class. More recently, and I work on this project, which is now an exhibition, an archaeological exhibition in Rome. It's called the Trajan Puzzle Project, and the exhibition is Trajan Building the Empire and Creating Europe. I try to use this case because it's a real case of a digital production. So here, we have this common situation you very well know in Rome, where we have the giant basilica of the Emperor Trajan, Basilica Ulpia. It's actually recognizable by few columns. The exhibition is based on actually the impact, the architectural impact of the Trajan Emperor in Rome, and most specifically, we were focused on the basilica and the reconstruction of the basilica. So in relation to the panels, I'm trying to see how different models, digital and non-digital, can impact our interpretation and can maybe change the point of view of, or a different, let's say, the view of what we think digital knowledge is. Well, this is the contextualization of the parametric model over the aerial photo of the so-called Trajan market in Rome. And this is the entire project. Let me say there are over 40,000 fragments, architectural fragments of Basilica Ulpia in the basement of the Museum of Imperial Flora. This is a big challenge, and a challenge of publication, a challenge also of digital accessibility. So to me, publication means access, open access, which is, I want to clarify this because academic publishing is something else, unfortunately. There is a lot of, not this publishing, of course, but the example we had before is actually on the opposite side. But we need to understand that there are several bottlenecks when we want to make the digital information available to a large audience and as well to the academic community. In our case, because this is a public exhibition, it's available, it's open, sorry, in Rome, so you can still go there until September. In our case, for the specifically for the let's say the digital reconstruction interaction with the Basilica Ulpia, we use a three kind of different methodological approaches: the haptic, the proprioceptive, and the kinesthetic. I agree with the last speaker about the necessity to use a multisensory approach and also multi-visual approach to the interpretation of archaeological information. Let's start with this empirical. So several fragments are in a very humid basement, and they are not even available in the museum. We start to scan several of them. You can imagine that for a small team of students and faculty, 40,000 fragments is too much. We started with a small sample of a small archive, and also we start with some, let's say, with the most important fragments for the exhibition, and then we use a combination of digital photogrammetry, laser scanning, and more. So after that, we start to discuss about how can we make this digital knowledge available to the public in a museum, which is also the location of the Basilica Ulpia. So it's not just the museum, it's the place. So it's a meta museum itself. So that's a very, it's not a unique case, but in Rome you can find something different. So the context is the core in this case. And then we start to work on the puzzle, the 3D puzzle of several fragments. This is specifically the friezes of weapons, which is one of the most important subjects in the Trajan's propaganda. So there's a lot of course, of political and social analysis over the importance of over the use of specific iconography. And then we start the reconstruction of the model, of course, in different domains. As I insist on the fact that the model should have different domains, so it can be used for augmented reality, for computer graphics, for different kind of interaction. Actually, in this case, the story I tell you is a bit different from the friends of Factum Arte. So we start from a fake, and we printed the fake. So the fake is a virtual reconstruction of a basilica based on, of course, academic studies and scientific simulation. But the 3D print is a plastico made by I see here 15 labs, because it was very intense, pretty intense 3D printing. So it's over 2,000 hours of 3D printing in order to assemble all the plastic, which is now in Rome. It's a new artifact. So my point is that in this case, I care about the new artifact. So the new artifact needs new kind of interaction, new kind of interpretation, because it's based on a reconstruction. You can go back to the reconstruction. It's based on a single simulation, and you can go back to the simulation. You can go even here. You can play at the end of the panel. So I printed here the forma urbis of Rome, so you can have augmented reality tool. You can put it here on the ground, and you have another basilica here. We can have millions of that, but the problem is what's the impact? What's the cognitive impact in this kind of information? How we can disseminate this information and make it available with all the critical understanding that every model is not the perfect one, is not the real one, and so on. So this is the design, the pre-design of the installation we made in Rome. Then we did another experiment, which is, again, in the same idea of digital redundancy. This is a very nice experiment of 3D holographic printing, an autostereoscopic full parallax copy of the Basilica Ulpia, 1 millimeter of plate. So you can have this 1 millimeter plate, you can move it all around, and you can explore it just going around with no stereo glasses, no head-mounted display. It's another artifact. Is this digital? Is this real? Is this empirical? Is this mediated? Is this okay? So look, this is the questions I have, and I like it. So I love the provocation we have thought at the beginning of the project in order to give the public the chance to interact the same content. Again, the Basilica Ulpia in the Trajan's age, in different digital and non-digital ontologies. And you know what? Well, we will see at the end of the exhibition, but the museum already adopted this in the permanent collection. So it's a new basilica in the collection of the Trajan Market Museum, now the Imperial Forum Museum. More. We use the same basilica for Oculus Rift, for digital immersive reality, and more. And when we have the augmented reality, actually the forma urbis here, which is one of the oldest maps in the ancient Roman Empire, is printed. So this is now in Rome is a very nice plate. You can go around. You can use different iPhone or tablet, but the concept is the same. You know, you have the basilica here. We have the basilica here. You can download this from the website of the museum. The IR application is available for free, of course, online. So if you like, you can search in the Apple Store, Ulpia VR, AR, and you can just play with this map. The concept here, for example, is the distribution of the model, no matter if you are in a museum, no matter if you are in Rome, no matter if you have a very expensive device, right? So, and then you can also go through the model, so you can see the interior, you can see the section of the model, and so on. Well, this is a very light model. Of course, you cannot, in augmented reality, you cannot interact with heavy model. then we start the last experiment, again, in the same philosophy of digital redundancy. We start to design a new system we call TITA, Tangible Interactive Table for Archaeology. This was entirely designed by archaeologists with designer from scratch. So it's a Duke project, a non-profit, of course, but this is a haptic table able to teach you how to assemble 3D prints, touching them in the real world, in the empirical world, and watching them in the virtual, in the 3D puzzles. You will see, and this is in Rome now in the Trajan's market. But the example is the interaction is a bit different. See, there's Arduino here in the background. There are different sensors, and then when you grab one of the 3D prints, they are results of the digital models we scanned before. Then you see how there's a freeze of weapons, so how every single weapon was used and what's the position of that fragments in the panel here. And also, well, more, let's say, this is the cultural part, the archaeological part is also to teach the user that, in the case of weapons, you can understand the power of the empire, because of course there are different weapons coming from different regions. And this is one of this is the last challenge of the project. So we made a prototype of a 3D repository of the Basilica Olpia, which is, give me a second, which is online now here. So there are several fragments in 3D available for everyone. And it's an ongoing project that we have in collaboration with the Duke University Library. We would love to involve libraries. I think libraries, university libraries are the core in this process of digital publication, because we need to tag models. We need to make them open, interactive, annotated, co-created, and so on. So I believe in that. I believe in the massive use of the models in order to create something else. And well, we know that this involves risk and concern. So my last slide, and if I steal 1 minute, it's about what positive and what maybe problematic we might have here. So you see here that we can disseminate, but we have always problem with authenticity. What is authenticity? What's the original? Where is the original? What about the copies? What about copyright and accessibility? What about ethical issues and communication? Actually, we overlap in this case, but it's very accidental. The content validation and the public engagement. Shall we vote for the academic authorship? So in other terms, we need to certify that in order to make the model valid or not. We should have them fly over and so on. This is part also the discussion of the Sevilla Charter and the London Charter as well, for example. Manipulation versus cultural transmission, technological, hyper-technological organization, learning experience, you know, and I believe the interaction and feedback will change in the future because we use a different kind of system. So to me, publishing is an embodied experience. Okay, I'm radically, maybe not yet available to convince the community that this can happen tomorrow, but I truly believe that we need to make this different. Embodied simulation is something else. It's not just about reading. In my classes, when I start provocatively about the future of digital technology, I tell my students, what if one day I can teach you 1 minute what you can learn in 6 months? Thank you.
What I'll do is is just start off with a question that I'm just going to pose to everybody to get your thoughts on. So throughout the presentations, which were incredibly exciting and engaging, dealing with so many different aspects of media, one theme that I sort of would be really interested to hear your thoughts on is how each of you sort of interpret some of the conflicts that we've been talking about between sort of the proprietary impulse that often happens when we create new works in new media and the kind of contravening goal of publication and open access and circulation of information. And it seemed like each of you have these tremendously creative projects, and you could answer that question in a lot of different ways. And so I'm curious as to how each of you interpret, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Well, I think that data should be free, basically. But of course, this is a real problem, because the reason that my app looks so crap is because I didn't have any budget to make it better, basically. And if I had budget to make it better, that money has to come from somewhere, and then, does that come from sales? Does that come from... So it's very, I think, because we have these huge corporations that can give you free email accounts and all that kind of thing, we get to the point where you go, well, of course we should have a free augmented reality multi-sensory app, because Google can do it, so why can't I? But actually, it takes a lot of time and it costs a lot of money, and it's very, very difficult to know how to fix that, and I don't know how to fix that. But maybe going through the university presses is an interesting route, actually, but I'm not sure.
If we're kind of going down the line. This is obviously something that our project has engaged with a lot, and we've ended up in a perhaps not entirely comfortable middle ground in that we've made the data free. And that is available open access in perpetuity. But we've then made the interaction and the storytelling and the analysis not free, although it's currently on open access preview. And we always get questions about this. Why isn't the whole publication available open access? And it is very much because, and we've had conversations with the University of Michigan Press about this, as Stuart says, there is a real and significant cost to producing these things, maintaining them, archiving them, forward migrating them every 3 to 5 years. And if you want to do all of those things, that money does, as you said, have to come from somewhere. And so, charging for the publication becomes part of that. So I think it's a larger societal question in that if we as a society want all of that content to be free, we have to essentially have it come out of our tax dollars, at which point it's not free, but it's not free in a maybe slightly more subtle way, depending on how the tax policy is written. But we have to recognize that there is cost to doing something that is valuable.
I recently have a conversation again with our information technology unit and the library. I have to tell you that the Duke Library, just for giving an example, spent $20 million for copyright every year. $20 million. So, well, it's not the good news, honestly. Even I know that this might help a lot of publishers and so on. The worst is that very few of this content is digitally available for a large population of students. So it doesn't mean that even with this investment, there is a lot available. Of course, there is a lot in the library, but it doesn't mean that there's a lot available for multiple users. For example, you might pay some copyright for 10 seats, 5 seats, and so on. I teach a class in classical archaeology. We have friends here that, the last Atlas of Ancient Rome cost over $500. That's 2 books, for example, nothing digital. So even if the 2 co-editors explain that this project is based on a geographic information system and a lot of digital information somewhere available, but it's not available right now. So to me, there is a problem of infrastructure. So I agree. It's a problem of cost, but there's a problem of strategies. I'm not sure if you know the entire history of TIDAR. TIDAR is a public, it's a project supported by Mellon, or was supported by Mellon, for sharing models and other digital maps, information, archaeological information. And TIDAR was charging dollars for any uploading. So I've calculated that I should pay over $500,000 just for uploading what I have in my lab. And you know, this is not, I think, I understand that cost of maintenance is high, but that's not, cannot happen in the humanities. You cannot have, you know, we can spend this, this budget. So I think we need to find a different kind of also agreement with maybe the publisher as well, because for example, the academic community review a lot for free. We do a lot of free for global publisher, but they don't release anything in exchange, even one single book to the library, not to us. So I think there is something to rethink with the publisher. So again, we have some ideas, but the problem of cost has to be, to me, faced together, because if you still have the books or the traditional books market, and then you have your wonderful project, I mean, of course that they do not match together. I think a very possible way might be to think about the digital publication as software. So you think this digital knowledge as a software, maybe you can rescale all the costs in terms of use and not in terms of infrastructure, just infrastructure. I mean, for example, fees and not so high cost because you need to maintain this forever, while the case is maybe to check how much the cost for that specific use. So that could maybe minimize or reduce the general costs.
We have a couple of minutes for questions.
I just wanted to say that maybe another alternative revenue stream is advertising, but of course dealing with the type of media that we're going to be dealing with, having adverts basically pumped straight into your VR headset might not be the way to go. But actually, this dystopic kind of thing might actually happen. I mean, you have pop-ups on websites already and that type of thing. I mean, if we are looking at this new way of, this new platform, new way of interacting with data, maybe you will have augmented adverts lying on your kitchen table that you don't even really notice. Scary, but actually might be a good way to make money. Sorry.
Museums have gift stores.
Yeah, exactly.
Fairly easy to have a click through one of the big online stores.
Yeah, and there was also a project up on Hadrian's Wall that was doing a lot of 3D scanning of the artifacts from Hadrian's Wall in the UK, and they eventually ended up opening an online store where you could download various bits, which I think probably wasn't particularly well received. I'm not sure, because of course once you download the digital asset once, it's very easy to replicate it. So there's so many problems with DRM and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, in the back.
Or another idea to redirect library budget that goes to subscription journals to open access. The budget is there, it just goes to their own outlets. It goes to stakeholders rather than back to the community and to the society, to academics.
One thing I wonder is, and I don't necessarily think this, but is it even worth keeping or trying to sustain the applications and the interfaces? Because those, especially given the way the technology is evolving, something that you built 5 years ago probably looks pretty old-fashioned. So maybe the real point is to try to keep the raw data and let the other things kind of migrate slowly.
Because I have designed online databases and that type of thing, and a web-based database is very different from just a spreadsheet or what have you, because it's deliberately designed to kind of lead you through the data. There's all sorts of ways that it's kind of created in order to make that, or those data, or that data, however you want to say it, kind of readable and explorable. And if you rip away all of those nice bits of tools and everything that you've been made, it's kind of like, basically you're left with the appendix of the book, and you've ripped out all of the kind of narrative that leads you through that data. So I agree with you that it's much easier to archive a CSV or whatever, but the way that's created, and especially with your stuff, I mean, the whole point is the interface and the data coming together as one. So I think it's kind of a difficult question.
How are the job opportunities for students from law school in copyright affairs or digital, or what your reality?
I think that, that's a really interesting question. I mean, this is a specialty that I think, the general specialty of intellectual property, the job market appears far more robust in recent years than it has been in the past. But this particular area that we're talking about, I've seen very few lawyers that are specializing in this, mostly because lawyers that advise on intellectual property issues regarding these sorts of projects are generally associated with the university, and so they'll provide information based on how to regulate from the university context. Yeah, in the back.
You know, part of the question of whether or not the front end is important has to do with the quality and attributes of the underlying data. You need a front end if the data is not semantically enabled. However, were your data mapped to something like the conceptual reference model made by ICOM and then produced as linked open data, people could go in and do searches and see how one thing connects to another and follow logically through this data without the need of any front end at all. And people who are looking at this stuff can read, you know, collect it and explore it however they want to do it. So isn't the question now more one of producing data that's semantically organized, that retains the relationship between that piece of data and another piece of data, rather than having some already obsolete front end to try to make those relationships work?
Well, it's a good point. We discuss a lot about that. For our experience, there's a bottleneck is that you need to know what you look for. So the problem of front end, back end is, to me, again, I don't want to take the opinion of the panel, but it's based on the fact that the majority of the users, including, for example, our students, but also general users, really don't know what to do with that. So again, I would love to, and I agree that, and this actually, I think, might be a good job for the library in the organization. For example, meta tagging the models, and instead of leaving the PI or whoever to make a draft interface or something. Well, we are not, we are not board designers, so we just try to make our job available. But the problem, again, is that if we don't create a clear workflow, what you currently recommend is not possible, because whatever I produce will be not compatible with many other things. And the most important is that all this kind of digital knowledge risks to stay in labs forever. This is unfortunately a dramatic problem, because then how we can, I know we are all the raw data, it's all there, but it's just backup. Backup is accessible for, in our case, to 5-10 people. That's it. So all the rest is mostly floating in this domain.
So in principle, yes, but in practice it's terribly difficult because of this problem of mismatching between user expectation, and we understand they're very different, you know, depends which angle, and content providers.
If I can comment and build on that. So it's in fact maybe my turn to go. I disagree. So I think semantically enabling your data is important, but it only takes you so far. I would say that there is a front end in the system you're describing, and that there's a Sparkle query engine, right, that you're using to interface with the data. So you do have a front end, and you have to have a front end. And so for me, I think we really have to think carefully, and the semantics are part of the picture, about how we build links between our raw data, our semantics, which are in a structured, formal way, hopefully communicating to people how we're scaffolding between our narratives, which maybe exist in our interface and our front end, and that raw data. I think semantics are really key to kind of building that scaffolding and explaining to people our research and our thinking process, and we could have a whole separate conversation about how good or bad the CDOC CRM is at doing this. And I think, though, that the front end is necessary. You know, language is a front end, right? When you're in a book, language is a front end because we're telling stories, and that's how we get people to understand and follow our path and follow our methods and access our data. And much as language is, you know, one way to do that, and virtual reality and augmented reality are other ways to do that. And the way that we lead people through our data and therefore get them to use it and engage with it and understand it, so it doesn't just sit in a digital archive in a way that no one understands for 10 years, is by providing these interfaces. Now, I agree that they die on a regular basis, and going back to an earlier question, I think we do have to be prepared to forward migrate, to kind of redo what we've done with our interfaces in our books, 3 to 5 years. I expect to have to pretty much reinvent the interface of what I'm doing. So I'm already planning how on earth I'm going to integrate your AR app into our next publication. That would be amazing for our ZooArc data. That would just be so cool. But I think that we have to really kind of value the front end and the media and the design of the information and the way we communicate it using these technologies as part of the process. It's not just the data, because raw data sitting there by itself is great, but not that useful human.
Okay, so we are almost out of time. I'm going to give Stuart the closing comments. These were the fireworks we were hoping for.
So I kind of think about it like listening to an album on vinyl. How about that to end, right? So it's old technology, but everyone knows that you listen to an album on vinyl and it sounds a lot better. You can't change the track order. The track order is ordered by the artist. You listen to that whole album and you get a very specific experience. You could rip that to MP3, you could mix and match, you could mash up with all sorts of other things, but the experience is not the same as the intended publication of that music, basically. And I think that's kind of the metaphor that I think about when we're talking about this type of thing.
Yeah, and that's a really nice way of, I think, closing the themes that we've talked about. So I want to thank all of you for being here. Did you want to say?
So we will, everyone who has stayed for this long, you deserve a drink. I will just like to, this is the end of our last panel. I would like to invite Rebecca Levitan, who's done so much to make this day possible, to deliver some short closing remarks, and then we will issue instructions on how to walk about 3 to 5 minutes across the campus of the Phoebe Hearst Museum, where we will enjoy beverages of the kind that you're wanting at this point in the day.
I'll take less than a minute. Thank you. Okay, super quick so we can get to the potable part of the evening. So this was a great day for me, and I think we can all agree that this event has taken many of the key questions and pushed them a whole lot further, of course, towards more questions, and I hope we can talk to each other about that at the reception. For that success, many thanks are necessary. I'll try to hurry. Of course, to the speakers and presenters today, And also DH at Berkeley, Digital Humanities at Berkeley, for their inclusion of the Past is Present in the week-long DH Fair, and those events will continue tomorrow, including a public demo of VR technologies on campus. They were also the sponsors of the reception at Deep Dive Limits of Immersion, the exhibition that will be taking place in Kroeber Hall, just around the corner from where our reception is, so I encourage you to check it out. Also, thanks to the Archaeological Research Facility for their support of the scanning workshop that will take place tomorrow. And of course, the Center for New Media, the primary sponsor of our event, and in particular, its director, Nicholas Damasio, and to Laura Wolf. So without Laura, we wouldn't have this beautiful space, we wouldn't have our food and drink, and the speakers wouldn't have arrived in Berkeley at all. So thank you to Laura for arranging all of that. Let's give her and Nicholas a hand. And yes, I would encourage you to join us as we walk over to the Hearst Museum, which is about a 5-minute walk directly across campus. There will be a reception there that's sponsored by Research, Teaching, and Learning, and they'll be also showcasing some of the work they do at that reception. So thanks again to our speakers and sponsors.